Everyone in Millbrook thought Frank Morrison worked too slowly, but no one had ever really watched his hands, the way they moved with surgical precision when installing engine parts, the same methodical speed whether he was changing oil or rebuilding a transmission, until the day his toolbox tipped over, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Among the scattered wrenches and screwdrivers lay something no one expected: empty brass casings. 50 caliber Frank Morrison had owned Morrison's Auto Repair for 15 years. The small garage sat on the edge of Millbrook, Kansas, population 3,200, a town where everybody knew everybody's business, or thought they did. Frank was the quiet mechanic who charged fair prices, did good work, and minded his own business. People respected him if they thought about him at all. At 58, Frank looked like what Central Casting would order for small-town mechanic. Gray beard, calloused hands, perpetually stained coveralls. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that ran perfectly despite its rust, lived alone in a small house behind the garage, and seemed content with his simple life. What the town didn't know was that Frank Morrison was perhaps the most dangerous man within 500 miles. The morning it all started, Frank was under the hood of Margaret Henley's Buick. Margaret was the town librarian, a sweet woman in her 70s who brought Frank homemade cookies every Christmas. Her car had been making a strange noise for weeks. "I just don't understand it," Margaret said, hovering beside the car. "It's been serviced regularly. Harold always said, God rest his soul, that a well-maintained car should run forever." Frank nodded, adjusting a belt tensioner with movements that were economical, precise, no wasted motion. A casual observer might think he was being careful. Someone with tactical training would recognize the efficiency of a man who'd learned that seconds could mean the difference between mission success and body bags. "Belt was stretched," Frank said simply. "Should be fine now." "You're an angel, Frank. How much do I owe you?" $20. He wiped his hands on a rag, the same methodical cleaning that had once followed weapons maintenance. As Margaret drove away, another car pulled up, a gleaming black BMW with Texas plates and an attitude that screamed money and impatience. Out stepped Richard Blackwood III, a development executive from Dallas who'd been trying to buy up Millbrook properties for a luxury resort project. "About time," Blackwood said, checking his Rolex. "I've been waiting 3 days for you to look at my car." Frank nodded toward the BMW. "What's the problem?" "Engine's making noise. Probably needs a complete overhaul, knowing my luck in this backwater town." Blackwood's tone made it clear what he thought of Millbrook and everyone in it. Frank popped the hood, listened to the engine for 30 seconds, then reached in and adjusted something. The noise stopped. "Loose belt," he said. "That's it? You're telling me I drove all the way back here for a loose belt?" Blackwood's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what my time is worth?" Frank closed the hood calmly. "No charge." "No charge? Great, just great. Maybe next time you could fix it right the first time instead of having me waste a trip." Blackwood pulled out his phone. "I'm telling you, this whole town is stuck in the past. No wonder it's dying." He stormed toward the office to get his keys, moving fast and angry. Too fast for the cluttered garage. His shoulder caught the corner of Frank's rolling toolbox, sending it crashing to the concrete floor. Tools scattered everywhere. Wrenches, sockets, screwdrivers, pliers, and mixed in with them, gleaming brass. 50 caliber shell casings. A dozen of them rolling across the floor like expensive marbles. Blackwood stopped mid-stride, staring. 50 caliber? What the hell are you shooting that needs 50 cal? Frank was already moving, gathering the casings with the same unhurried precision he used for everything else. "Collector," he said simply. "Collector." Blackwood picked up one of the casings, examined it. "These are fired, recent by the look of the brass." Frank continued collecting his tools, saying nothing. Blackwood's expression shifted from confusion to something else. Suspicion, maybe fear. .50 caliber is military, sniper rifles. What exactly did you do before you became a mechanic? Fix things, Frank replied, standing with the last casing in his palm. Just like now. For a moment, the two men looked at each other across the garage. Blackwood saw a grease-stained mechanic in coveralls. Frank saw a soft civilian who'd never faced real danger, never had to make decisions that kept others alive. I want my car now, Blackwood said finally. Frank handed him the keys. As the BMW pulled away with unnecessary speed and tire squeal, Frank noticed the small crowd that had gathered. Word traveled fast in small towns. Tom Gardner, who ran the hardware store, approached first. Frank? Those were really .50 caliber? Military surplus, Frank said. Picked them up at a gun show. It wasn't exactly a lie. He had picked them up at a gun show 15 years ago when he'd needed brass to reload ammunition for his retirement present to himself. A Barrett M82 sniper rifle that was perfectly legal to own and absolutely lethal in the right hands, which Frank Morrison's very much were. Didn't know you were into guns, Tom said. Don't talk about it much. Frank began organizing his toolbox, each tool going into its precise place. Old habits. As the small crowd dispersed, Frank thought about the casings. He'd been careless keeping them. In the old days, that kind of carelessness would have gotten him killed. Or worse, gotten his team killed. But that was then. Frank Morrison, the mechanic, was supposed to be harmless, invisible, forgotten. Frank Morrison, the Delta Force operator, was supposed to be dead. The problem with the past, though, is that it never really dies. It just waits. That evening, Frank was closing up the garage when a familiar sound made him freeze. The distinctive rumble of a military transport truck. He'd heard thousands of them over the years in dozens of countries, and he could identify the make and model by sound alone. This was an M35 Deuce and a half. Old but reliable. Not standard issue anymore, but the kind of vehicle someone might use if they wanted to blend in while still having military capability. The truck stopped across the street from the garage. The engine shut off, but nobody got out. Frank continued his closing routine, but every sense was now alert. The way he moved changed subtly. Less like a tired mechanic, more like someone who knew he might need to fight or run. After 10 minutes, the truck started up and drove away. But Frank had seen enough to worry him. 2 men in civilian clothes but with military posture, and one of them had been watching the garage through binoculars. Frank finished closing up, but instead of going home to his small house, he drove to the edge of town and parked at an overlook that gave him a clear view of the main roads. He waited. At 11:47 p.m., the military transport returned. This time it parked behind the Millbrook Motor Inn. Frank watched through his own binoculars as 3 men got out. Even at this distance, even in civilian clothes, he could read their training and how they moved, how they positioned themselves, how they communicated with hand signals. Special operations. Definitely. But whose? Frank drove home via a circuitous route, checking for tails. His small house looked exactly as he'd left it, but he went through it room by room anyway, checking for signs of intrusion. Nothing, but he slept with a loaded .45 under his pillow for the first time in 5 years. The next morning brought another surprise. Colonel James Harrison, standing next to a rented sedan in Frank's parking lot. Frank recognized him immediately, though Harrison had aged considerably in the 15 years since Frank had last seen him. "Hello, Frank," Harrison said quietly. "We need to talk." Frank set down the oil drain pan he'd been carrying. "I don't know any Frank. I'm Morrison. Frank Morrison. I fix cars." "Cut the shit, Sergeant Major. I know who you are." Harrison glanced around the empty garage. Impressive disappearing act, by the way. It took us 2 years to confirm you hadn't actually died in that helicopter crash." Frank said nothing. In the old days, Harrison had been his commanding officer. A good one. But that didn't mean Frank trusted him now. "You're wondering if I'm here officially or unofficially," Harrison continued. "The answer is both. Officially, Frank Morrison is a mechanic who lives quietly in Kansas. Unofficially, Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews needs to know that someone's been asking questions about him. Matthews." Frank hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 15 years. "What kind of questions?" he asked finally. "The kind that suggests someone knows you didn't die in Afghanistan." Harrison pulled out a tablet, showed Frank a series of photographs. "These were taken yesterday. Professional surveillance, but not ours." The photos showed Frank working on cars, talking to customers, closing up the garage. Taken with telephoto lenses from multiple angles. Very professional work. "Who?" Frank asked. "We're not sure, but 3 of your old teammates have died in the last 6 months. Car accidents, heart attacks, house fires, all very convenient, all very final." Frank studied the photos more carefully. The surveillance was good, but not perfect. The photographer had missed the small mirror Frank kept positioned to watch the street. Had been visible from the overlook, where Frank sometimes went to think. "Someone's cleaning house," Harrison continued. "Eliminating Operation Crossbow personnel." Operation Crossbow. Frank hadn't thought about that mission in years. Tried not to think about it. "Crossbow was buried," Frank said. "Files destroyed. Everyone involved sworn to secrecy. Officially, but you know how it works. Files are never really destroyed. People talk, and sometimes political winds change, and someone decides that old operations are embarrassing." Frank handed back the tablet. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to disappear. Again. For real this time." Harrison's expression was serious. "Your cover identity is compromised. We can give you a new one. Relocate you." "No." The refusal came immediately. "I'm done running. Done hiding." "Frank, Sergeant Major, you don't understand. Whoever's hunting Crossbow personnel has resources. Money connections, government-level intelligence assets. This isn't some revenge-seeking warlord. This is professional." Frank looked around his garage. At the tools he'd arranged with military precision. At the work bays where he'd spent 15 years fixing the vehicles of people who trusted him. At the small office where he kept photos of satisfied customers and thank you notes from people whose cars he'd kept running through hard times. "I understand perfectly," he said finally, "but I'm not running anymore. If someone wants Frank Morrison, they can come find him." Harrison studied his face. "You've gone soft. 15 years of small-town life, and you've forgotten what you were." "Have I?" Frank's smile was cold. "Why don't you stick around and find out?" That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, trouble arrived. 3 men in a black SUV with tinted windows. They parked across the street and watched the garage for 2 hours before driving away. But Frank had watched them too, and what he'd seen confirmed his worst fears. Professional surveillance, military-grade equipment, and one of them, the driver, had the distinctive scar pattern of someone who'd survived an IED blast. These weren't just contractors. These were operators, and they were here for him. Frank finished work early that day, telling his customers he had a family emergency. As far as anyone in Millbrook knew, Frank had no family. But that was about to change. Because Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews was coming out of retirement. And Frank Morrison, the quiet mechanic, was about to remind some very dangerous people why Delta Force operators never really retire. They just wait for the right mission. The attack came at 3:17 a.m. Frank had been expecting it. The professional surveillance, the pattern of elimination that had claimed his former teammates, the way the watchers had positioned themselves around town. It all pointed to a coordinated strike designed to look accidental. What they hadn't counted on was that Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews slept very lightly and had spent 15 years preparing for this exact scenario. The first indication was Rex, the neighbor's dog, suddenly going quiet. Rex barked at everything: cars, cats, wind. When he stopped barking, it meant someone had neutralized him, probably with a tranquilizer dart if they were trying to keep things quiet. Frank rolled out of bed in complete silence, muscle memory guiding him to the concealed panel behind his bedroom closet. Inside were items Frank Morrison, mechanic, had no business owning: night vision goggles, tactical vest, suppressed H and K .45, extra magazines, flashbang grenades, and encrypted radio. He was dressed and armed in under 90 seconds. Through the night vision, he could see them: 4 operators moving in perfect coordination toward his house. Professional spacing, proper use of cover, disciplined fire control. These weren't thugs or amateurs. Frank smiled grimly. Neither was he. The lead operator reached the front door and began working on the lock. Standard entry procedure. Frank let him get it open, let them commit to coming inside, before he activated the surprise he'd installed years ago, but never thought he'd use. The motion sensor triggered a recording. Frank's own voice, slightly distorted, coming from speakers throughout the house. "Gentlemen, welcome to my home. I regret that I can't greet you personally, but I'm currently positioned approximately 150 meters southeast of your entry point with a .338 Lapua Magnum rifle. The red laser dots you're seeing on your chests are not for intimidation. They're for target acquisition." The operators froze. Through his scope, Frank watched them try to locate the source of the voice while dealing with the psychological pressure of knowing they were in someone else's crosshairs. "You have 30 seconds to withdraw," the recording continued. "This is not a negotiation." 2 of the operators began moving toward the exits immediately. Professionals who recognized a superior tactical position when they saw one. But the other 2 held their ground, which told Frank something important. They weren't just contractors. They had orders that superseded self-preservation. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. Frank didn't kill them. He could have. The first shot would have been easy, and he could probably have taken all 4 before they reached cover. But killing them would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer, and bodies would bring federal attention to Millbrook. Instead, he put a single .338 round through the engine block of their SUV, followed by shots through all 4 tires. The message was clear: you can leave, but you're walking. The recording played one final message: "Tell your employer that Frank Morrison sends his regards. And gentlemen, don't come back." By the time Sheriff Peterson arrived, alerted by worried neighbors who'd heard gunshots, Frank was back in his house, having entered through the tunnel he'd dug years earlier that connected his garage to his basement. The tunnel was one of several modifications Frank Morrison had made to his property. Improvements that would have seemed paranoid to anyone who didn't understand the enemies Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews had made during his career. "Frank? You okay in there?" Sheriff Peterson called out. Frank opened the door, wearing pajamas and a bathrobe, looking appropriately confused and sleepy. "Bill? What's all the commotion? Reports of gunshots? Someone saw men around your house?" "Gunshots?" Frank looked genuinely puzzled. "I didn't hear anything, but I sleep pretty soundly." Peterson looked around the yard, noting the disabled SUV across the street, but finding no immediate evidence of violence. "Must have been hunters. You know how sound carries at night." "Must have been," Frank agreed. After Peterson left, Frank retrieved the surveillance equipment he'd hidden around his property. The night vision footage would make interesting viewing, but more importantly, it would help him identify his attackers. What he saw on the recordings made his blood run cold. The team leader was Marcus Webb. formerly Captain Marcus Webb of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Frank had served with Webb for 3 years, had saved his life twice, had been best man at his wedding. If Webb was hunting him, then Operation Crossbow's survivors weren't just being eliminated by strangers. They were being killed by their own people. Frank spent the rest of the night making phone calls to numbers he hadn't used in years, calling in favors from people who owed him their lives, activating networks he'd hoped never to use again. By dawn, he had a clearer picture of what was happening. 7 members of Operation Crossbow were confirmed dead. 3 more were missing, presumed dead. That left Frank and maybe 2 others from a 15-man unit that had once been the most classified, most capable special operations team in the U.S. military. Someone was cleaning house. But why now? Why after 15 years? The answer came with his morning newspaper. Buried on page 6 of the Kansas City Star was a small item about congressional hearings on military accountability, specifically focusing on black operations conducted without proper oversight during the War on Terror. Someone in Congress was asking questions about operations that were supposed to have never happened. Operations like Crossbow. Frank poured himself coffee and considered his options. He could run, as Colonel Harrison had suggested. New identity, new location, new life. But he'd already run once, and it had cost him everything he'd cared about. His career, his friendships, his sense of purpose. Or he could fight. But fighting would mean revealing himself, abandoning the quiet life he'd built, and probably dying in the process. The decision was made for him when his phone rang at 8 a.m. sharp. Frank Morrison. The voice was professional, military-trained, with a slight southern accent. Speaking. My name is Colonel David Chen, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. I think we need to talk. I think you have the wrong number, Colonel. I'm a mechanic. Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews, Service Number 1, 23-45-6789, enlisted June 15, 1985. Served with distinction in Panama, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen countries that don't officially exist in our files. Awarded the Medal of Honor, 3 Silver Stars, and the Distinguished Service Cross. Presumed killed in action, September 23, 2009, during Operation Crossbow. Frank said nothing. We know you're alive, Sergeant Major. We know what you've been doing for the past 15 years, and we know someone's trying to kill you. What do you want? I want to offer you a job. One last mission. Help us find out who's eliminating Crossbow personnel, and we'll make sure you can live out your retirement in peace. Frank looked out the window at his garage, at the small town that had become his sanctuary, at the life he'd built from nothing, brick by brick, day by day. Where do you want to meet? He asked. The abandoned grain elevator outside Millbrook had been Frank's idea. Isolated, easily defended, with multiple escape routes and clear fields of fire in all directions. Old habits. Colonel Chen arrived precisely on time, driving a nondescript sedan and accompanied by a single aide. Frank approved. A larger entourage would have attracted attention. An overly casual approach would have suggested either incompetence or a trap. Sergeant Major Matthews, Chen said, extending his hand. Frank Morrison, he replied, not taking it. I've been dead for 15 years. Let's keep it that way. Chen nodded. Fair enough. Frank, then. Thank you for agreeing to meet. They walked into the grain elevator's main building. Frank had arrived 2 hours early to check for surveillance, weapons, or booby traps. The building was clean, but he'd positioned himself where he could see all approaches and had a clear path to his truck. Let me be direct, Chen began. Operation Crossbow is compromising current national security interests. Someone is systematically eliminating everyone who participated, and we believe they're working toward a specific goal. Which is? silencing everyone who could testify about what really happened in Afghanistan. Chen opened a briefing folder. Crossbow's official mission was counterterrorism. The real mission was something else entirely. Frank knew this, of course. He'd been there. But he let Chen continue. Someone in Congress is pushing for hearings about military contractors and off-the-books operations. If Crossbow personnel started talking, it would embarrass some very powerful people, Frank finished. More than embarrass. It would expose war crimes, illegal arms dealing, and the murder of foreign nationals who were supposed to be under U.S. protection. Chen pulled out photographs. These are the contractors who were paying for Crossbow's services. Most are now in positions of significant political or corporate power. Frank studied the faces. He recognized several, men who'd grown rich from wars they'd helped orchestrate, who'd built fortunes on the graves of soldiers and civilians alike. You think one of them is cleaning house? We think several of them are working together. But we need proof. Evidence that would stand up in court and protect national security at the same time. What do you want from me? Chen's aide opened another folder, revealing surveillance photos of Frank's garage, his house, his daily routine. Whoever's hunting you is going to try again. We want you to let them. Use me as bait. Use you as bait with backup. We'll have a full tactical team in position. When they make their move, we capture them alive and make them tell us who's giving orders. Frank considered this. It was a reasonable plan, tactically sound with acceptable risks. It was also almost certainly a lie. What aren't you telling me, Colonel? Chen smiled grimly. You haven't lost your edge, have you? The truth is, we don't just want their contact. We want their employer. And we think the only way to flush him out is to make him believe his cleanup operation has failed catastrophically. Meaning? Meaning Franklin Matthews comes back from the dead. Publicly, dramatically, in a way that threatens to expose everything. Frank understood immediately. They weren't asking him to be bait. They were asking him to paint a target on his back that would never come off. And after this hypothetical employer is caught, new identity, new location, federal protection for the rest of your life, which will be considerably shorter than my current life expectancy. Probably. Frank appreciated the honesty. It was more than most officers would have given him. I need time to think about it. Time is what we don't have, Chen replied. Intelligence suggests the next attempt on your life will be within 72 hours, and this time they won't be sending a reconnaissance team. As if summoned by his words, Frank's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. The mechanic's toolbox is full of secrets. Some tools are meant to be buried. Chen read the message over Frank's shoulder. That's not a threat, that's a countdown. Frank deleted the message and pocketed his phone. All right, Colonel. You want Franklin Matthews back from the dead? Let's raise some hell. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Frank would return to his normal routine, but with modifications that would attract attention. He'd make it known that he was asking questions about his old teammates, that he was suspicious about their deaths, that he might have evidence of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Chen's tactical team would position themselves around Millbrook, ready to move when the killers made their play. One thing, Frank said as they prepared to leave. When this goes down, innocent people might get hurt. The folks in this town have been good to me. We'll do everything possible to minimize civilian casualties. That's not good enough. Frank's voice hardened. Anyone in this town gets hurt because of this operation, and I'll consider our deal null and void. Chen met his eyes. Understood. Frank drove back to Millbrook as the sun was setting, thinking about the people he'd come to care about. Margaret Henley with her weekly car troubles and homemade cookies. Tom Gardner, who trusted Frank to fix his delivery truck. Sheriff Peterson, who'd never asked too many questions about Frank's past. They deserved better than to become collateral damage in a war that had started before they were born. But they also deserved to be protected from the kind of people who thought murder was an acceptable solution to political problems. Frank parked his truck behind the garage and walked through his domain one last time. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, he was still Frank Morrison, mechanic. But deep inside, in places he'd kept locked away for 15 years, Sergeant Major Franklin Matthews was preparing for war. The next morning, Frank opened his garage early and began making phone calls. Loud phone calls, the kind that would be easily overheard by anyone with surveillance equipment. "Yes, I'm asking about Staff Sergeant Wilson's death," he said to directory assistants. "I know it was ruled accidental, but I have some questions." "What do you mean his wife won't talk to me? Did someone tell her not to?" An hour later, "Hello, is this Captain Morrison's widow?" "Ma'am, my name is Frank Morrison. No relation. I served with your husband. You don't want to discuss it?" "Ma'am, I think his death might not have been natural." By noon, he'd made similar calls about all his dead teammates. Each call was designed to sound like someone getting suspicious, asking dangerous questions, preparing to cause trouble. The response came faster than expected. Richard Blackwood III, the development executive from Dallas, returned to Millbrook at 2 p.m. But this time he wasn't driving a BMW. This time he arrived in a black panel van with 2 companions, and none of them looked like real estate developers. Frank watched them through the security camera he'd installed and made sure it wasn't hidden as they surveilled his garage. Professional work, but not quite professional enough to avoid detection by someone who knew what to look for. At 4 p.m., Frank made his most provocative call yet. "Kansas City Star newspaper? I'd like to speak to someone about military corruption." "Yes, I have information about a classified operation called Crossbow." "No, I can't discuss it over the phone, but I have documentation." 20 minutes later, the van was gone. But Frank knew they hadn't left town. That night, Chen's team moved into position. Snipers on the grain elevator and the water tower. Tactical units in the abandoned buildings on Main Street. Electronic surveillance to monitor all communications in and out of town. Frank went through his normal evening routine, turning off the garage lights, locking up, walking to his house. But instead of going inside, he activated the most elaborate deception he'd ever planned. The figure that entered Frank Morrison's house was actually a mannequin dressed in Frank's clothes, moved by remote control and designed to cast convincing shadows on the window shades. Meanwhile, Frank himself was already in position in his real command center, a reinforced bunker he'd built beneath his garage, equipped with enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. The attack came at midnight. This time there were 12 of them. Full tactical gear, night vision, suppressed weapons, explosives. They moved like a military unit because that's what they were, though not one Frank's government would have authorized. They surrounded the house, cut the phone lines, jammed cell service, and prepared to breach simultaneously from 3 directions. Frank watched it all through thermal imaging cameras, recording everything for posterity. When they breached, they found the house empty except for the mannequin, which Frank detonated remotely. Not enough explosive to kill anyone, just enough to announce that their target wasn't as helpless as they'd assumed. That's when Chen's tactical team made their move. The firefight lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 4 attackers were dead, 6 were in custody, and 2 had escaped into the Kansas darkness. But Frank had what he needed: prisoners who could identify their employer, evidence of a conspiracy, and proof that Franklin Matthews was very much alive. Colonel Chen found Frank in his bunker, cleaning weapons that hadn't been fired. "It's over," Chen said. "The shooting's over," Frank corrected. "The war's just beginning." Chen showed him a tablet with breaking news. Congressional hearings postponed indefinitely following terrorist attack in Kansas. Terrorist attack? That's the official story. Unknown militants attacked a small town. Fortunately, heroic federal agents were conducting training exercises in the area and were able to respond quickly. Frank understood. The truth about Operation Crossbow would remain buried. The congressman asking uncomfortable questions would back down, and the powerful men who'd ordered the killings would return to their lives of wealth and influence. "What about me?" Frank asked. "Frank Morrison died in the terrorist attack. Very tragic. The whole town is mourning." Frank nodded. He'd expected this. Chen handed him an envelope. "David Parker, retired Marine, living in Maine. Military pension, clean background, small house near the ocean. You'll like it there." Frank pocketed the envelope without looking at it. "And the people who ordered this?" "Will be dealt with appropriately, meaning they'll receive stern warnings and continue living comfortable lives." Chen's silence was answer enough. Frank climbed out of his bunker and looked around his garage one last time. 15 years of careful work, of building relationships, of trying to be someone other than a professional killer. "There is one other option," Chen said quietly, "which is, stay dead. Let Frank Morrison be mourned and buried. But Franklin Matthews, he could work for people who appreciate his particular skills. Freelance, well compensated, targeting the kind of people who think money and connections make them untouchable." Frank considered this. It wasn't justice, not the kind Margaret Henley would recognize anyway, but it was the kind of justice soldiers understood. The bad guys die, eventually, in ways that can't be traced back to us, but that send a message to anyone else who might think military personnel are expendable. Frank smiled for the first time in weeks. "Colonel," he said, "I think David Parker is going to enjoy his retirement." The house in Maine was perfect. Small, isolated, with a view of the ocean and no neighbors for miles. David Parker had settled into his new life with the same methodical precision Frank Morrison had once brought to engine repair. The workshop in his basement contained tools no retired Marine should own, but then David Parker wasn't exactly a typical retiree. The newspaper article was small, buried on page 12. Defense contractor dies in skiing accident. Richard Blackwood III had apparently lost control on an expert slope in Aspen, struck a tree at high speed, and died instantly. Very tragic. Completely accidental. The kind of thing that happened to wealthy men who took unnecessary risks. David Parker folded the newspaper and returned to his current project, planning the unfortunate fate of the next person on his list. Outside, waves crashed against the rocky Maine coast, and a retired mechanic turned Marine enjoyed his well-earned retirement. Some tools, after all, were meant to stay sharp.